Well, during the 80s and 90s, a lot of people in our country agreed that drugs were a rampant problem, one that was destroying our communities. The effort to quell the tide of drug-related crime in this country saw bipartisan support for new mandatory sentencing laws that required judges to impose long prison sentences based on drug quantities alone. In hindsight, we see that mandatory minimums meant that a lot of offenders received sentences that were excessive when viewed in light of their unique situation. The challenge today is to find the right balance, a balance between sentences that are tough enough to punish and deter without over-punishing. The fact that over the last 30 years or so, our country's made enormous strides in law enforcement practices, and we've been successful at apprehending and prosecuting thousands of people who violate our country's laws. While the reduction in crime rates is absolutely a positive thing, the explosive increase in our incarceration rates is not. While we're by no means the most populous country in the world, not even close, we do have the highest prison population in the world. And we incarcerate more people per capita than any other industrialized nation, even more than Russia or China. Sadly, many of those Americans who are languishing in our jails and prisons are not violent offenders who pose an ongoing threat to our communities. Rather, many of these are nonviolent offenders who were subjected to mandatory sentencing laws. Well, I think our challenge today is to reverse the tide of over-criminalization, over-incarceration, and over-sentencing. Make no mistake, those who choose to violate our laws need to be punished. But we have to ensure that punishments are fair. Long mandatory minimum sentences make sentencing in some cases unfair because they often require judges to impose really long prison sentences without looking at all at the facts of a particular case. So after many years of being tough on crime, I think it's time for us to also be smart on crime. While all of us benefit when our streets are safer, the price of over-incarceration is being paid, I believe, by the politically marginalized and those who are economically vulnerable. Homes are often torn apart as fathers, sons, uncles, nephews, and older brothers and younger brothers are being sent into prison, often for far more time than their conduct deserves. The absence of those men leaves a chilling void in too many communities. A void that requires members of those communities to limp along without these people who have been put in prison. It's the families and the neighbors who are left behind that bear the highest costs of our justice system, and that's one of the reasons why it needs to be reformed. The Smarter Sentencing Act is a targeted, narrowly focused bill that proposes incremental reforms that would allow judges to impose fair sentences. Because it doesn't reduce maximum penalties for any offense, judges would still be able to impose really long sentences on the very worst offenders, for example, on kingpins and cartel bosses. But for lower level nonviolent drug offenders, judges would be able to impose prison terms that better fit each crime without the ill-fitted constraints that mandatory minimums sometimes require. And doing this, making this change, would save taxpayers money. The Department of Justice and the Congressional Budget Office agree that the Smarter Sentencing Act would save taxpayers billions of dollars in the coming years. This is only the beginning of the cost savings, because I think the biggest cost savings are expressed in terms of human costs rather than just in dollars. Aside from the obvious savings to taxpayers, this bill is important to me because I think once a person is paid a modest price for his crime, he should have the chance to return to his family and return to his community and get his life back on track. We need a justice system that helps people move forward, away from a life of crime and back to a fulfilling life and a law-abiding life. warehousing nonviolent drug offenders for excessive periods of time tends to lock them and their families in the past, and this needs to change. You know what, maybe the most important change for conservatives is the realization of what high incarceration rates mean for America. While we certainly believe that America should be a world leader, we question the morality of leading the world in incarceration rates when our crime rate is no longer higher than other industrialized nations. As a conservative, I recognize that prisons cost money, and we should be wise in the way we spend taxpayer money. As a conservative, I question the wisdom of giving the Department of Justice unchecked power, the kind of unchecked power that minimum mandatory sentences often provide. As a conservative, I believe people who commit crimes should be punished, but the punishment should fit the crime, and too often mandatory minimums don't fit. Certainty of punishment is more important than severity of punishment. As a conservative, I believe that once people have served a modest sentence, they should return to their families and their communities to get their lives back on track. It's time for conservatives to recognize that we can and should be the leaders who make these changes happen and make them possible and put them into law. The Smarter Sentencing Act enjoys support of people across the political spectrum. It's been endorsed by groups ranging from Heritage Action and the American Conservative Union to the NAACP and the ACLU. It has sponsors from both parties in both houses of Congress. It's time for Washington to recognize that America wants to see change in this area.